Hi, friends. Welcome to another episode of the 10 Laws podcast with East Forest. I am East Forest. It's been another wild week, and thankfully we have more of these conversations together. This one is with the wonderful Mirabai Starr. She's someone who's kind of woven through my little path with the Ram Dass Sangha, and I saw her here and there, and we were at the virtual retreat together that we did with Love, Serve, Remember a few months back. And so I really wanted to get a chance to get on the pod and dig into her world more because she has such a wonderful, beautiful history and beautiful insight as well. And one thing I wanted to note, because we recorded this a while back, and there's a moment about halfway through the podcast where we recorded this probably right on the day or the day after George Floyd was killed. And at the time, neither of us, well, particularly me, I wasn't as tapped into the news, and I was kind of picking up the bits from the just things I heard here and there. And so there's a moment where we're actually like talking about that, but we're just sort of piecing it together, and we didn't even know George Floyd's name in the moment. And we're both stumbling through that, and I look it up, which seems like a remarkable moment now because it's such an it was such an iconic, powerful event that's loudly reverberating through our lives today, which is good. That it's continuing to produce change and meaningful thinking. But I just want to point that out when that happened and why there's a moment where we're like, what is his name? That's why, because it was pretty much happening in real time. So I always have to give that kind of context these days. But otherwise, this week that we're releasing this, then, I've been staying productive, but I've been having my own ups and downs emotionally, and sometimes the times where I kind of have it feels like some people might call it a freak out. I might try to positively spin that and say a moment of new rebirth of the chicken cracking out of the egg and something trying to emerge, a pain point, a nodal point, the pain body, whatever it is, the fire burning the field so we can sow our new crop of our future of humanity. I've had some of that this last week. And I think it was definitely spurred on a bit, here in Idaho and in Utah, the two states I've been in are increasing now in our COVID. And I know that's already happened in other places, but now it's hitting home here. And anytime you're in a family pod, so we've got I'm acting as the part-time stepdad, PTSD, the two kids, Radha, and then they spend time with their dad and his partner. So that's the other pod. So we're all kind of in this pod. And then stepdaughter has a boyfriend. So I guess now he's in our pod. And then they have their close friends, which you try to, manage. But let's be honest, can you manage 16-year-olds hanging out with their friends? No. So the pod's getting a little loosey-goosey, and it makes some anxiety in me about all the efforts we're doing in a COVID sense, where all the things you can't control and the ways that we are being forced to let go in things beyond the sphere of just me. And it's a challenging acceptance of wow, I guess it's sort of like accepting that you have to step into the viral fire, whether you like it or not. And, from day one, that was something that we heard from a lot of the experts. It's going to be 60, 70% if everybody gets this. It's just sort of a matter of time, and we want to slow it down. And I don't know about you, but I've just kind of I don't want to get it. Nobody does. Whatever you think about it, nobody wants to potentially fall ill because it's a freaking drag, let alone how it ruins your life. And some people die, and the economic impact of this in a lot of ways is much, much worse. And there are no good answers here. But anyway, this week, it felt like a shift as we're moving into summer and schools are definitely ended and then cases are rising. It's kind of whoa, we need to reorient the ship here, and I don't always know how to reorient it, and been sitting with that. As I'm sure a lot of you are dealing with all these changes, and there isn't any kind of top-down leadership on this, so it's up to us to figure out what what's right for each of us. And I know that can be hard sometimes. It can be hard. But look, I saw something in the news today about companies that are pulling their advertising dollars out of social media. I haven't looked deeply into this, but I just want to say from a cursory look at it, it's heartwarming to think that why are we waiting for legislation to change or the company itself like Facebook to change their policy, which they haven't done for years. And then all of a sudden there's a collective decision amongst the people who are spending money with them saying, hey, we're not going to give you money anymore unless you change this. Even if that's from popular pressure, it's still, that's what happened. And now they're freaking out, the company, Facebook, and maybe they're going to change. I think it's an indication of how we can do that with other things. We don't need to necessarily wait for, the government isn't passing laws sometimes that 90% of the populace wants. That's not much of a democracy. So it's like sometimes we can do it with the power of the dollar. Sometimes we can do it by bypassing the government in a sense. So I think that's an interesting silver lining or an interesting light in the dark that's been happening. And it goes into this tide of massive change that is happening that at the end of the day is good. Again, it's that field being burned so that we can fertilize. But we're still burning. We are still burning the field, and that's okay. But be careful. We don't all want to get burned and die. We were trying to do something good here too. We're trying to fertilize for something new to grow, something tender. But we're in that process, and we can't see what is around the corner quite yet. But have faith, my friends. Keep walking your walk because it's happening. It is all happening and blossoming as it always has been, but now it's really happening in a stronger blossoming right now. Thanks for everyone who has been supporting this podcast, for those reviews. I know I say it every week, but it really makes a big difference. There's not many things you can do to support the podcast besides leaving your reviews and sharing it on social media and sending me a message if you're enjoying things or you have suggestions. I love all that. You can send messages to team@eastforest.org, and you can leave reviews on social media. Just making one and sharing it is awesome. And you can also do it on Apple Podcasts. A little 5 stars or a written review goes a long way. It helps me get the guests that you want to see and have the meaningful conversations that I want to have and that we're having together. The retreat in Utah, we're still thinking it over. If we got to shift it or move it or keep it in early October, it's probably going to have to move. But we haven't made that decision. We're still just trying to think of options, essentially. So stand by on that. Anyone who gives a deposit would have the option for a refund or shifting it to the new dates, TBD. And thanks for those, thanks for you guys for purchasing merch things like East Forest perfume oils and the Ram Dass vinyl. It's sold out, but we're hopefully going to press another pressing. It might take a couple months because that's how vinyl is. But thanks for buying the things that you are buying as gifts or for yourself, because it's one way to help me support this whole ecosystem. Yeah, a lot of my merch is sold typically, most of it, at shows on the road. And because I haven't been playing any shows, not selling as much. And I don't always think that the world needs more stuff, but I try to make things that are meaningful and can help awaken parts of that inner space. That's why I like scents and, of course, music. But maybe we'll have some more fun stuff coming up soon. But there's a new item. There's a flash drive that has Music for Mushrooms, a soundtrack for the psychedelic practitioner in high resolution, like super high 24-bit waves. So that's the only place you can get that because it only fits on a flash drive because it's such a massive 5-hour album. But that's a new thing I put up. And if you're interested in that, check it out, eastforest.org. Okay, so let's get into this conversation with our dear friend, Mirabai Starr. Well, I actually wanted to start there because that's sort of actually where, if I was trying to think about a starting point for where I was introduced to you, it was through Love, Serve, Remember. It was through Ram Dass. And that's been a point of connection for me with a lot of really wonderful people. And so, there's still, I feel like, many people in that orbit that I would love to take the time like this to just be able to connect and say hi and to be able to explore a bit more like your own history. So maybe a great place that would help me, give me some context, and maybe the listeners too. I know with Ram Dass in particular, you do have a little bit of a unique way that you guys cross paths, and it was quite a while ago. Could you just give us a little bit of that background? Because you had an interesting upbringing as well.
Sure. So let's see, I just turned 59 a couple weeks ago. And when
Happy birthday.
Thank you. When I was 14, I met Ram Dass, although our paths had sort of already intersected, believe it or not, because as you alluded to, my parents were part of the whole counterculture movement of the late 60s and early 70s. So they were kind of older hippies, but definitely part of that wave of consciousness that was rising around the Vietnam War and the ending of the war. They were peace activists. They were social justice Jews, pretty much atheist Jews, but their spiritual lives centered around human rights and civil rights and early environmental issues. And so that's what led us into what was called then the Back to the Land movement. So they uprooted us from our suburban Long Island lifestyle, which already, by the way, was deconstructing itself in the 60s. Like already, even in New York, in suburbia, we were living communally. College students were
on Long Island.
Yeah.
Where in Long Island? I went to school in New York.
Oh, Wantagh.
Oh, okay.
Like Young Beach. But my grandparents were all in the city, Brooklyn and.
Sure. Well, knowing what I know of folks on the East Coast, that's a big leap.
It is.
To exit the tri-state area and be like, we're going into the world to live a different life.
Yeah, or leaving the world. It was.
Yeah, exactly.
And turn on, drop out phase of things. Yeah, so it was. And it was, an urban suburban environment to a very rural lifestyle in Taos, New Mexico, which is where we ended up. But it was a period of time when people were kind of on an odyssey. Counterculture families were packing up their kids into vans and campers, which is what we did, and going on this kind of hippie enlightenment circuit. And part of that was driven by Be Here Now. Be Here Now came out in 1970, right? And It was 72 when my parents plucked us out of our lives and stuck us in this camper and began to travel around. And we mostly traveled in Mexico. And part of that was looking for Maria, I can't remember her name, and the magic
Sabinas?
Yes.
Maria Sabina, yeah. You didn't find her?
We didn't, but they did do mushrooms at Agua Azul, which was outside of Palenque in Chiapas.
Wow.
And then we ended up just camping on a beach, an isolated Caribbean beach, now known as Cancun, but it's empty, and for many months, and then ended up in Taos, New Mexico. And Taos was very near Lama Foundation, where, of course, Ram Dass created with the Lama community Be Here Now just a couple of years before. And that was part of the pilgrimage, find the place where Be Here Now happened.
Okay.
And then I ended up getting very involved with Lama because Lama was running the school. In those days, they called them free schools, the alternative school that my siblings and I went to. So by the time we got to Taos, I was 12. I just turned 12. Maybe I was still 11. Can't remember. And the school was taken over at that time by Lama Foundation. And so a lot of the teachers at the school were like Neem Karoli Baba devotees who spent half their time in India. And a lot of teachers of all different spiritual traditions came through the school. And then eventually the older grades started spending more and more time at Lama Foundation, actually for schooling. And I just ended up staying. Once I was, my 13 to 14 was when my own spiritual awakening really began. A particular event precipitated that. And that's when I met Ram Dass.
What happened? I mean, at 13, 14, I suppose, going back in time, that might be an age that is somewhat common for a coming of age. And maybe there's vestiges of that with the bat mitzvah, bar mitzvah even. But now I would say that would be kind of early in modern life for some kids to really start to awaken on a spiritual level. It seems You were ahead of your game there. What can you tell us more about that? Because it
Yeah, I
perks
don't
up
think
my interest.
of myself as having been advanced in any way, but yes, I definitely had a passion for spiritual life. And I think a couple of things precipitated that. One was that I was accidentally dosed with LSD when I was 13 at a party at a commune called the Magic Tortoise on Llama Mountain. Many people know the Magic Tortoise because it was one of those kind of iconic 60s, 70s communes in northern New Mexico. Northern New Mexico has been a real crossroads for a lot of different spiritual and social experiments for millennia, actually, but for decades, certainly. And it was, it was at a party and the kids weren't supposed to get into it, but it was just in a punch, really, a lemonade. So I had a terrifying experience, not knowing that I was tripping on LSD at all, not knowing that that was what was happening. It was only later that we were able to unpack it. But it changed everything. And actually for at least a year, I was having trouble not being in an altered state of consciousness, being in any.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was very scary, and the adults were so into their own experiences that nobody was really tracking me at all. And or to the extent to which they were paying attention, they were like, "Wow, far out, you kid," like there was no real care of my psycho spiritual being. But those were the times. I mean, there was a lot of love. It wasn't exactly neglect, but it would be certainly seen as neglect from contemporary standards and from 50s standards. But that was one thing. And then toward the end of that period, that was like early 13. At the end of my 13th year, just as I was turning 14, my first boyfriend, Philip, died in a gun accident. And that I think combined with these altered states of consciousness that I was slipping in and out of just blasted something open in me. And right at that time, Surya and Sharada had just come, our drama and music teachers had just come back from India. Neem Karoli Baba had just left his body, I think, at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And they brought home with them this comic book about the life of the poet Saint Mirabai. There are all these comic books about the lives of saints in India and the gods and goddesses, as you know. And so this one was on Mirabai, and we wrote a play. All the students got together and we wrote a musical with the music and the choreography of the dances and bhajans, singing kirtan. And I was cast as Mirabai. And so Philip had just died maybe a couple of weeks before. I had had the acid experience maybe 8 or 10 months before. And when I entered that stage at Lama Foundation, the big geodesic dome at Lama, the famous dome, I walked onto that stage. I'd just been dressed in this beautiful wedding sari. And I sang my first opening song of Mira calling out to Krishna, God of love. It just all broke open. And that bhakti energy, I'm not sure if your listeners are familiar with the terminology, so I'll just name it. Bhakti yoga, of course, in the Hindu tradition is the path of love and devotion. Yoga meaning path to union. So bhakti yoga, which is by far the kind of largest raft, to use Buddhist language, in the Hindu tradition. Most people practice bhakti yoga who are Hindus, I guess. The path of love and devotion became completely my path. It was this passionate love longing that filled me, that I'm sure was interconnected with the loss of my first love and other losses. Actually, it had a number of significant deaths in my life from an early age. So I think death became a portal for me to spiritual connection, paradoxically, because it was about loss and longing that opened the way to this unitive kind of experience.
You were cast in the play, and it seems like the play is continued. It's like
It unfolds the lila.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And so Ramdas gave me about maybe later that summer. Let's see. Yes, no, it was a year. Sorry, it's a long time ago now, Krishna. A year later, I went off. I left Lama and left home and went off with Ramdas. Followed him to New York, and that's when he officially gave me the name Mirabai.
Oh, well, we have that in common. Names from Ramdas.
Yes, which is unusual. We didn't dispense names very readily.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose in some ways my story is so different because I didn't meet Ramdas in person until the end of his life, the last 2 years of his life. And then it was like this very rich experience. But
You were such a gift to him, Krishna. Such a gift to him.
oh, he is such a gift to me. He's all over the place here and with pictures and I feel like it's still unfolding so much in my life. That experience, it still feels very alive in the way that it's continuing to unfold and resonate with people, but in a very alive way.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, it has new meaning, the things that he chose to speak about in our recording sessions. That was in when was it? 18, I guess. Yeah, 2018, the summer. And it has a fresh meaning after he died, right? When he's there talking about death and all these things. And it's like, but it just, obviously it has a different context and power, thinking about how close he was to that edge. And then now in this COVIDian space that we're in too, this like the deeper, larger death and transition. And it's something I actually wanted to talk about. So I'm glad you brought that up, about how that was a way of transformation in your own life. Because I'm sensing on a personal level and on a macro level a kind of death, a different series of deaths, the death of our future in a way, our perceived previous future that we, previous future is a weird phrase, but I know in this there's a transformation occurring and wanting to happen and happening, whether we like it or not. But I'm struggling with it at times. Because I want to bring as much grace as I can to it. But I also, when you don't know even what's actually happening, other than that you see the change and transformation. And I want us to dive into this a little bit about what's happening now, maybe the lens of a death, the lens of loss in general. Mm-hmm. And I know you have a lot of experience with bereavement and grief. And it's such a tricky area for me. I'll just say the last thing. I know Ramdas would say the phrase, like, when he's grieving, he feels the closest to God. And I remind myself of that, but it still hurts. It still hurts to not know and all these emotions come up, like anger and loss and sadness and frustration. And what are you feeling? And how can we bring more grace to this transition?
All right. And can we bookmark? I have a question for you, which is how come he called you Krishna, and how is it for you?
Yeah. I'll just tell you that. I mean, I've told my listeners this, but I'll tell you because I'm happy to. I was hanging out with Vishnu Das, who you might know. He's one of, and we were just. I was there for a week recording Ramdas, and I think I had one session. I was going back for another one. It was in between, and maybe I asked him about his own name or something, and he said, well, Ramdas named me. And he said to me, he says, you can ask for a name. And I was kind of struck by that. I was like, what do you mean? That sounds crazy. And he's like, if it feels right. And he just kind of left it like that. And so it was just sitting in my mind. And after our last recording session, I was packing up. It was just me. And at the time, my partner was there and Ramdas. And I knew that I might not have another time with him, certainly alone. I might, but I thought it's highly likely you won't. It was kind of like being in the spiritual White House. I kept thinking in my head, it's like, how did I get here? Like, oh, this is special, having alone time. This is special. Like, the door's closed, no one's bothering us. Like, I knew that was unique. And so I just thought, it's now or never. And I thought, I'll take a risk. And I knelt down and we were looking at each other, and I kind of blathered about how I'd heard this or that, and it's okay, you don't have to, but no big deal. But if you're feeling like it, all that kind of stuff. And he's just nodding and looking at me. And then I finished my rambling, and he was just staring at me. And I actually thought he either didn't understand what I was saying or didn't agree or whatever.
Mhm.
And I actually just like thought, anyway, I was happy I took the risk, but I got to move on. And maybe 10 minutes passed, and I really went through this whole thing in my head where I went all the way to the process of letting it go and feeling stupid for asking, and he was meditating on the ocean with his beads, and I thought he was doing his own thing. And then he said, Krishna, and I still didn't get it. I thought he was talking about the music in the hall, and then he said it again, and I still didn't get it. He said it again. I still was like, I'm not following you. What are we? And then my partner was like, this is your name. And then it all kind of hit me, and it just broke me open. But what's been amazing about the process is that ever since then, like the teaching unfolded much more after then, in that it's one word. And to be totally forthright, I didn't know a whole lot about the mythology behind it, just the broad strokes, and barely anything at that. And now it's when other people call me that, and probably to them it's no big deal. It's like, what do you want to be? What's your name? You tell them, and they use it with you. It's because
Mirabai.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's a reverse mantra in a way. So every time I hear this sound, it's a calling to me to drop my baggage and just be something new in the moment, or like just a new sense of who I am in now. And I thought that was a really powerful teaching on his part, because I certainly wouldn't have done that for myself. And out of love, we didn't know each other that well. We knew each other on a soul level, but we didn't really know each other. And he just offered me that gift, and it's been unfolding and unfolding and unfolding, and will continue the rest of my life.
Yeah.
And that's where it came from.
Beautiful. So. Beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. It's nice to have a conversation. I do a lot of holding forth, so I like to be much more of an exchange, and I was curious about that.
Yeah, and he named my partner Radha, which I thought he thought was hilarious, and so it is.
Yeah, that story is a little fraught, but I'm sure you've been exploring it.
Yeah. So it's been an embodiment, and yes. So
death. That's a good segue.
Which it was a death of kinds for me. It was kind of a death of old thinking, or an invitation for that. It was a doorway, because things. I mean, I want to let you answer, but I was actually just talking to my friend yesterday about how death is not something that's gone. It's more something that you live with in a different way. Like you loosen the grip, because things continue to live with you, just in different forms. And maybe that's what's happening right now, is we're like holding on to certain things.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a death happening, and some of us are really excited about it, and some of us are terrified, and some of us oscillate.
Yeah. What day is it? What time?
Yeah. So, maybe I can start to respond a little bit to this field of question around death by being very literal and naming Ram Dass's death, since he is our common denominator here, and has been so influential in both of our lives and in the lives of so many of your listeners. I am grieving Ram Dass's death. He has been part of my life, 25, 35, 45, 55, for 45 years.
Wow.
And which is the majority of my life.
Yeah.
And I don't even yet know what the landscape is going to look like as I go forward without Ram Dass in his body in my life. And it wasn't like over those 45 years he was always there. He wasn't always there, partly because I wasn't always there. I had to have periods where I withdrew. There was a period when I fired Krishna, by the way, long period, but then I took him back, like Radha did.
Mm-hmm.
And there were times when, yeah, I was more and less connected with Ram Dass. Early on, I was very connected to him, and the last 20 years of his life, I was very connected. There was a period in between when I was less so. But still, so much of what I do and say and write and am was informed by that particular human being, Ram Dass. And I can't even separate, and I've said this before, I said it to him when he was alive. When I'm teaching, I can't even tell like what comes organically from my own being and what was formed in my consciousness by him. It's so threaded, it's so braided and entwined with my consciousness, his, his teachings, his way of teaching, drawing on all the different world's religious texts and teachings, and his humor and his iconoclasm, his way of being very kind of subversive in his teaching, which Maharaji was for him. So that's my lineage. It's a nonlinear lineage, as Raghu calls it, and Krishnadas calls it, and but it's rich and it's real. So even though we were all expecting Ram Dass to die for a very long time, years, and even though I'm happy for him, that he's free from that painful body, pain-ridden body, I fucking miss him. I miss him. And I'm sad. So that I just want to name that. And so leading to the way in which this period of, did you call it COVIDia? What did you call it?
I keep calling it COVIDian.
This COVIDian period.
COVIDian time, yes.
Yes, a new geologic age.
Yeah.
It seems to be so much, as you said, and I know you've talked about this with other guests on your podcast, a time of the death of structures that we have either cherished outright or unconsciously just relied on, that to hold us and to keep things more or less expected. Things could unfold the way we expect.
Expectations, exactly. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so it's a period of radical upheaval, radical unknowing. And what I'm finding for me, okay, so my first book, so I have a dozen or so books on the mystics of different spiritual traditions. That's kind of my thing. And the last one was Wild Mercy, living the fierce and tender wisdom of the women mystics. So looking at women mystics across the spiritual traditions, that's really where my heart is right now, feminine wisdom, and reclaiming it from the patriarchy, which is alive and well in all the world's religions, even the ones we think are alternative, like Hinduism and Buddhism, which are still quite patriarchal. But anyway, so my first book was a translation of Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross, the 16th century Spanish mystic. And the Dark Night of the Soul is all about radical unknowing. It's a sign of spiritual maturity, according to John of the Cross, when we enter periods in our lives where everything we thought was the way it is it kind of comes undone. It's a dismantling. It's not us dismantling it. It just kind of happens. It's an artifact of our growing and maturing on the spiritual path. And in the beginning, the Dark Night of the Soul just feels like dryness, like aridity, like a desert, spiritual desert. Like we can chant with Krishna Das all day long and nothing happens. The bliss that we used to get isn't happening. We can listen to East Forest music that blasted open our hearts and melted us into the heart of the one. And it sounds like a commercial jingle for Cheerios. It just doesn't, it's not striking the heart chord and connecting us with that felt sense of the sacred. That's the beginning of a Dark Night of the Soul. And then if it progresses, if we're strong enough, and if we're yielding enough, if we can surrender into that aridity, John says, we will enter the deeper, more transformational Dark Night of the Soul, which is a conceptual undoing. It's when all of our spiritual ideas and our belief systems are unraveled and they don't make sense anymore. And so that seems to be what's happening right now. And it is a death. And all the spiritual traditions tell us, we have in different language, that we must die before we die. That fana in Sufism, that the annihilation of the illusion of a separate self. These ego deaths that have to happen. I'm much more interested in the feminine version of that. That's much less austere and harsh. And
Well, yeah, because I'm freaking out a little bit because I'm thinking like I see all this happening and I feel it happening, and my fear is like, how do we not fall into the darkness so much that like we lose ourselves? I mean, what are the traps of this? I mean, maybe the feminine perspective or the energy of this is important for you to voice.
yes, thank you, Krishna. It is. I really feel it is, because I am in the process of reclaiming, as I said, all of these classic spiritual teachings, the refuge prayers and Buddhism, the vows, and all of these different, in Judaism, you know, the mitzvot, the mitzvah of keeping the Sabbath holy, for instance, thou shalt, all of those I'm reframing
Right.
and reclaiming through the feminine heart. And so if we were to reclaim the beauty of the dark night of the soul by weaving in the heart of the feminine, I think what we're invited to do is to abide in the most feminine space I know, which is the space of the mystery. In Taoism, in the yin yang symbol, the dark side is the feminine side. It's creative, it's fertile, it's mystery, it's wild and ungovernable. And that, I feel like, is the very space that we're in globally right now. We're in the feminine space. It's liminal space. It's ambiguous. It's mysterious. It's fertile and creative and wild and unpredictable. And my feminine heart is right at home here. And I think the feminine heart of the world is flourishing in the mystery right now, because it's accelerating and allowing for the crumbling of these structures that have had to go for a long time. And we're being forced to disengage from some of the machinery that's been driving us all, that wasn't aligned with our own deepest values for many of us. Now that we're forced to let go of some of those things, I think we're recalibrating as a human family, and so that we can re-engage more consciously and more lovingly. Now, before we move on from that, I want to claim my privilege here and name that I recognize that as a middle class-ish, still somewhat countercultural, middle-aged white woman who teaches spiritual stuff for a living, I have the privilege of being home and making enough money, not a lot, but enough to sustain me and my family right now, and that I can turn inward and do this deep interior work. And I can do it personally, and I can do it collectively with the various communities that I'm being called into these days in the COVIDian age. And I know that many people don't have the privilege of doing this inner work right now. So here's what I want to say to those of you who are grappling with that. Like, I can't tell you how many, often, every day, people say to me, I feel so guilty because I'm doing fine and I'm actually enjoying this period of rest and renewal, and I'm doing more yoga and I'm writing and I'm painting, and and I know people are suffering. And here's what I feel so strongly is that for those of us who do have the privilege of yielding to this unknowing right now and being more still and reconnecting with our creativity, music, art, writing, whatever it may be, the cup that we're filling in this time is going to be needed as we go forth into whatever the world looks like on the other side of this. And I don't think there's going to be a clear other side. I think it's going to be a gradual liminal space. But that our renewal and our reconnecting with our deeper selves and our creativity and our joy is exactly, and our equanimity is what will be needed going forward. And I just want to end this by saying John of the Cross, when he talked about the dark night of the soul and how harrowing it can be to feel disconnected from God or to feel like all your belief systems are not holding you up anymore, he said, when we surrender to this space, it's not empty at all. It's overflowing with what he called a kind of ineffable sweetness. What you called, Krishna, grace or graciousness. So it's hard
Ineffable sweetness. Thank you for sharing that. What comes up for me is for the dudes out there who are maybe embodying their masculinity that perhaps is in friction with this darkness, the feminine darkness. I love this idea of the fertileness and the grace and the sweetness of the darkness. I mean, maybe that is the challenge, is there's a structure that is crumbling and falling and changing. Let's call it the patriarchy or the masculine energy. And it's for those of us who are men and who are perhaps living in a lot of that energy, that can be where the response is coming from. The stress is manifesting perhaps as anger, all the emotions. And so what do you recommend we can do to work with the masculine energy that's obviously still needed because it plays a role,
Yes.
but it's maybe that's part of the dis-ease that we're feeling.
Yeah, beautiful. I think you're onto something here. Couple of things. One is that, and this is familiar to everyone, I think we all have masculine and feminine energy in ourselves, and some men have lead more with their masculine, and others lead more with that feminine energy that's more real and alive for them. And we all know women who lead with a kind of patriarchal style. And so just want to acknowledge that, and people of all genders and people who do not identify with a single gender, I think find themselves at various times leading with one of those energies or another. And I think all human beings are longing for the feminine right now, that the human family has been dominated by a masculine paradigm for thousands of years. And one of the things about this period, this liminal period that we're in, is we have the opportunity to consciously shift to a more feminine style of leadership that is more rooted in the heart and in relationships, which does not preclude dudes figuring things out, dudes in the form of men and in the form of women, figuring shit out to help us navigate the disintegration of these structures that we have relied on. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing, okay, here's a perfect example. So we are pretty much sheltering at home. We being my beloved husband Gangadas and I. We've been together for 23 years. We've raised a family. We have grandchildren, but we're not really seeing any of our kids right now because he's older than I am. We're just being careful. So today we had our big expedition to Lowe's in Espanola, New Mexico, which is about an hour south of Taos, a small town where they happen to have a big hardware store because we're doing all kinds of projects in the COVIDian age. And when we were driving home, we were listening to Democracy Now! And today they were focusing on, help me, Krishna, the name of the man that was just killed by the cops.
Yeah, I've been seeing this, and I'll be honest with you, I've been taking a little bit of a break from some of the news. I don't know sadly, I can guess what happened, but I don't know what happened.
I feel bad that I forgot his name.
We can get his name.
Yeah,
we have the answers.
So, yeah, okay.
Oh, wait, I'm on a computer right now.
Okay, good.
You can keep talking. I'll get his name.
You'll get it. So we were listening to this. I heard about it yesterday morning when I woke up, and it broke my heart to hear about this Black man who was apprehended by the police for suspected, using a counterfeit bill to buy groceries. And they threw him down on the ground, handcuffed him, and they were 4 white cops, and he was a Black man. And one of them put his knee on the man's neck, and the man calling out, "I can't breathe." And
George Floyd.
Floyd.
Yeah.
George Floyd.
Yeah.
George Floyd, we are speaking your name. And
Yeah.
he was calling out, I can't breathe. He was calling out for his mother, Mama, and he died. They fucking killed him. And so we were driving home through this beautiful canyon, the Rio Grande Valley. It's very dramatic, beautiful. Um, we're listening to this, and we're having my husband and I, Gangadas and I, are having two completely different experiences. I am crying. I take off my sunglasses to wipe my eyes, and he's like, "Are you crying?" It's like, "Yes, I am crying." And I said, "What are you feeling? I mean, doesn't this break your heart?" He said, "I am just so angry. I am so angry." So we were, a foot apart in the truck, and he's consumed by rage, and I am consumed by sorrow. And we both acknowledged silently, but it was clear because we've been married a long time, that our two experiences were both valid, and that he was having his and I was having mine, and they were both right, and they were both real, and they were both necessary. They're both necessary and transformational. Like, this is the alchemy. Alchemy happens through fire. It's not easy.
Yeah, it's we have to remind ourselves of these hard lessons of like we're here to go through, the grist of the mill. We're here to face challenges, to learn, to grow, to have experience. And why wouldn't the experience be as rich as it could possibly be dreamed up?
And it's more intense for me now. I am the skin around my heart is thinner, and I'm feeling it all more than ever before. I've always been a feeler, but I'm not worried about it, Krishna. I guess that's what I'm trying to say, is that I believe that my willingness to enter into the fire of the broken, open heart is necessary right now. There's also a lot of joy right now, but both of these things to fully be in them in ways that I haven't been able to when I was just driven by the tyranny of tasks that was part of my life 2 months ago when I was traveling all the time.
True. I mean, there are many openings there are so many more doorways that have opened up for us to step through these spaces that just were not there before. Is that, though, the kind of similar advice or how you'd work with someone who's dealing with bereavement?
Yeah.
Like a similar process of having them step into the fire of the heart?
Yes and no. I mean, yes. When I sit with people, I sit with them in the fire. Like, I climb right on in there. And it's not like I just decided I wanted to be a grief counselor when I grew up. I mean, it's like someone who counsels alcoholics. It's hard to trust someone if they haven't also been an alcoholic. I am, bereaved mother. My daughter Jenny was killed in a car accident when she was 14, which was the day that my first book, Dark Night of the Soul, came out. And that has really informed my path. I was 40, so it was almost 20. Oh my gosh, almost 20 years ago. And so there was no other response possible, but eventually to step into a place of holding space for other people whose children have died or whose loved ones have died. And so when I invite people to be with what's happened to them, I'm not doing that from some kind of plateau, or pedestal of never having suffered an unbearable, shattering loss myself. So I just wanted to say that I also don't tell people early on, like, just sit in the fire. It's okay. You need to enter into it and be with it, and it will transform. I don't give people I don't impose any agenda on people whose hearts have been shattered in grief and loss. I just try to be with them and bear loving witness to them. So it's the first thing I want to say. But I, through my own experience, discovered that very delicately, gradually, with tons of self-compassion, found that I had to enter fully into my loss when my daughter died, partly because I wanted to honor her and I didn't want to check out. I didn't want to not feel it. not be with it and not like hold her in a way through my own grieving her. It felt disloyal to not show up for the experience somehow. And it was an act of love for me to sit in that fire. And it took time, at first you could only dip a finger or a toe or, and then eventually little by little, it was sort of like I've died anyway. The death of my child killed who I was. She died with her. And so I have nothing to lose. And sometimes when we're most shattered is when we can most surrender. And it was, for me, it was in that surrendering process to the grief, to the loss, to that fire, to that tidal wave. Sometimes it was a tidal wave that I saw coming and I just couldn't get out of the way. So I just gave in. That I reconnected with my kind of youthful longing for God, that early Mirabai Krishna thing that I had sort of matured out of over the years and become more non-dual. And I reconnected through the fire of grief to the power of yearning for the beloved that had been so much part of me at the beginning of my spiritual path. Because grief and loss feel to me like the same landscape as longing for God who I don't even believe in with my analytical mind. So yes, I guess my counsel to people, because that's what you keep asking in some way or another gently, is like, what would you offer to people in this time of radical unknowing and harsh realities of the inequities of our economic system and our racial systems, our racist and white supremacist systems? Like, how do we, what Ram Dass used to say, keep our hearts open in hell? How do we be of service? And I guess one of the main things that I learned from Ram Dass is if I think I'm helping somebody else, then I'm setting up a dualistic reality or unreality that is a gaping chasm that cannot be crossed. But when I allow my heart to open and melt into the warmth, let the warmth of that care melt the boundaries between myself and the other, then I recognize that there isn't an other, that we're all interconnected in this web of being and we belong to each other. And I will know if I don't check out and turn away, my heart will know what the right offering is for this time and this particular form that I've taken. Jewish wisdom, mystical wisdom anyway, says that we're each imprinted with exactly what is ours to do in this world, to give, to be. And sometimes we just need to get quiet enough to connect with that and to dispense with the preconceptions about what it means to be of service. Like, look at those activists and they're chaining themselves to the gates of the Pentagon. I should be doing that, but maybe what is mine to do is to make beautiful music and make that a meditation. Maybe mine is to write books that are poetic and yummy, use sensual language to wake up the heart. Who knows?
Right. Yeah, when we live in a world that's very quantifiable, I think that's an important point to recognize, that how we step into service isn't quantifiable. It's an energy, it's an intention more than it's kind of a result, in a sense. You use the phrase to step more fully into the experience, like when you're talking about the grief. Do you remember, do you know, like, how you do that? How does one choose to enter more fully?
So I wrote a book about this, and I'm not trying to sell books because all the authors out there know you make around 11 cents a book, so it's not anything. But if people have experienced the transformational power of grief and loss, you might resonate with some of it. Plus, it has my counterculture story, and I think it's dedicated to Ram Dass. Yes, it is. And in that book, I talk about heartfulness practice. And, I didn't make that up. I mean, I did for this book, but lots of people have used that term, come to that term themselves. And what I mean by that is that I've had decades of training, of meditation training, particularly in the Vipassana tradition, mindfulness meditation practice, that invites us to be present with what is. So if we're sitting in meditation, we're not trying to get some particular results or attain altered states of consciousness or anything else. We're just showing up for what is and becoming curious about it. Now, when it comes to shattering loss, traumatic loss, any kind of transformational loss, and it doesn't have to be just the death of a loved one. There are lots of ways that we experience loss. It's that practice almost sounds brutal, like I'm just going to be with it. I'm going to use my spiritual muscles and lift it.
Force my way in. Yeah.
But a heartfulness approach is still a practice of being present, of cultivating presence, but it's done with love. It's done for love. So in the case of losing a loved one, I'm not saying that you have to sit on the cushion and close your eyes and turn inward and meditate through your loss. I, for one, couldn't. My meditation practice went right out the window. All spiritual books were bullshit. I couldn't deal with them. Belief systems, platitudes, all of you grievers know what I mean. No patience for platitudes of any kind. But there was this deep desire to get quiet and to turn inward and to be with what had happened. That, in fact, all the people crowding in and trying to fix me was unbearable to me. Like, just please leave me alone. I just need to be still. I need to turn inward. I need to be with this. And in that process of just clearing, I tried to do it nicely, but when you're freshly grieving, sometimes you're not so nice. But my loved ones were very forgiving. I just needed alone time and spaciousness to just sit. It wasn't sitting in meditation. It was to just be and look out the window and do nothing and allow the shattered pieces of my life to just kind of fall around me and sit in the wreckage. And it was holy ground, that wreckage, and find a very delicate, quiet connection, a new way of loving this person that I had been loving in her body, my child, my 14-year-old daughter, who I was in the middle of mothering. Teenagers.
Wow.
Everything was about Jenny. And then everything was still about Jenny, but it was a new metaphysical relationship that needed to be forged, and it could only be forged in the quiet of my heart. And I could also tolerate other bereaved people, the company of other bereaved people.
It reminds me of Ram Dass talking about the seed of the witness, and which he would bring up a lot. It came up a lot on at least the album when we were recording, and it seems like a similar state of allowing.
Yeah.
Of sitting with something, but it's just witnessing it. And that he kept talking about that, like that being the seed of the soul was another phrase he used. You kind of interchanged them at times. Like he used it in that song Dark Thoughts, where he's talking about, to witness the dark thoughts and then to love them, as opposed to all the other machinations we can do to deal with dark thoughts. Yeah. And that's something I keep coming across in my own life since then. It's this sort of idea of being in the seat of the soul and watching the show go by. And now, easier said than done at times, but it's a powerful vantage point to try to be in the place of witness, because it feels, just the fact that I can even do that, like who's witnessing what, and it's sort of in itself starts to prove something to me of like, oh, I guess that's the show. You've spent decades, as you alluded to, working with all sorts of different religious traditions and looking at these teachings and looking for connections. I've read that that's something of your work. Through all that time, have you been sensing some overarching through lines between them, between this diversity of teachings, that maybe, does any of it speak particularly to this extremely modern transition that we're in?
Yes. Thanks for that rich question. So a lot of that is up for me right now. My decades of interspiritual studying, practicing, and teaching, I am reevaluating in this time myself. So I'm giving you the kind of living version of where I am with it. Right?
Perfect. Yeah.
So the threads, first to answer that question, that I have discovered, I think is what we all intuitively know or know through experience, and that is love and justice, like threads of social justice and environmental justice that are in all the world's great spiritual traditions. And also love, so love in the form of justice, and also love in the form of a yearning for union with the one that flows through all of the spiritual traditions.
Right.
And I think that I've said, a lot in various places in print and in speaking, that some of us are temperamentally more interspiritually inclined than others. Others are more sort of built to pick one tradition and set down a deep root, Zen Buddhism or Christian, Christianity, Christian mysticism, or whatever it might be, to just anchor ourselves in a particular spiritual landscape or space. And I call those people the keepers of the jewels, because I think it's really important to safeguard the beautiful treasures that lie at the heart of all the world's spiritual traditions. And then there are people like me who respond, whose hearts naturally kind of open in the presence of the sacred all over the place, in all the religions and all the spiritual traditions. And people like me find it impossible to say yes to one tradition if it means saying no to all the others. So I think that's kind of the way, like, some of us just are. And I think a lot of you who are listening go, yeah, I've always been that way. I've always, loved a good Passover Seder, and then going to Mass at the Spanish Mass at the church in San Francisco. And I, Neem Karoli Baba is my guru, and I have a Buddhist meditation practice, and I do sweat lodge and so on. And they're all streams that originate from and flow back into the same pool of truth. But here's what's up for me. Okay, right now in this time. One thing is, I think the world's religious structures are falling apart anyway. They already have been for a long time. Most of them are crumbling. People are leaving churches in droves, and new people are not wanting to be ordained. And a lot of the existing religious structures are irrelevant to a lot of, especially millennials and younger people.
Right.
They're suspicious of them. They don't relate to them. And yet, younger people that I know are still on fire with desire for truth and for spiritual experience.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got the keepers of the jewels who are holding these treasures and sharing them. We've got people who are saying, you know what, the structures actually don't work. Let's create something that's because they're so hierarchical, they're so patriarchal, they're so dualistic. Let's create community, spiritual community together that is informed by all of our gifts. And I see that happening, which to me is a much more feminine approach. But the last thing I want to say about this whole interspiritual quest, which I'm still very much engaged with, and I'm very interested in the leadership coming from the margins, from women, from people of color, from people who are genderqueer, from younger people who have such wisdom and aren't generally heard or respected. All of those voices, those are the ones I want in my spiritual communities. But I think we have to be careful also about cultural appropriation during this time. Like, I have been blithely helping myself, I've noticed, to the spiritual, um, um, what would you call them, resources of all of these different cultures. I'll take a little collie here, and I'll help myself to some white buffalo calf woman there, and I'll just, take all of these. I'll draw the nectar from all these flowers. I'll turn it into my own version of honey, and that's fine. I'm entitled. And as a white woman, I mean, Judaism gives me a little bit of a marginal experience, but not enough because I have white skin. I am starting to recognize my own inherent white supremacy and how I have, as an interspiritual teacher, encouraged other people to help themselves, other white people generally, to help themselves to all of these different cultural treasures. And so I'm reevaluating that right now, Krishna. At the same time that I feel like the old structures have to go, a new spiritual landscape is emerging. It is much more interconnected, and it is more feminine, and it is more collaborative and relational. And I think we have to be super conscious and respectful of the traditions that we are drawing from as we enter into this new spiritual landscape.
Thank you. I was speaking to Bayo Akomolafe.
I love Bayo.
Yeah, and he used this word a few times of composting.
Yeah.
Or this other idea of the metamorphosis, and both of them are speaking to this idea that as opposed to taking something and taking it apart and building a new house, it's actually transmuting into a new thing, like chemically, structurally, on its most basic level. And that is a necessary process that is happening. So it's sort of like, out of respect, we are allowing it to compost by bringing it all into the garden to compost.
Yeah.
And I feel it gives us a little slack to say we're standing on the shoulders of giants by, honoring how it's the soil that new things grow out of, all of it, and so it again speaks to how we began this, or I did, where we don't know what's going to grow fully. Everyone can take a good guess, and some of them might be right, but we don't. It's not here yet. It's still emerging. It's a process that is still becoming, and we're very much in it, as we always have been. But it seems like we're in a nodal point now that is much more pronounced than before, and we're all experiencing it sort of at once, which is extremely unique. We used to, one person is in a kind of grief, and normally in life, another person's in a whole different experience. We're all just doing everything all at once on the planet. But right now, there's one thing tying us together. And I don't know if there's been a moment like this in human history that we all knew about. Now can all communicate about it and spread the information around the globe. It's very unique in how we're tensioned together with these tubes of the internet, so we can all just sort of like hive mind it all at once and have podcasts and all the information, and then the virus itself has its own transmission system to go around the planet, just like the internet, but it's us being busy and flying everywhere,
Yeah.
So there's a lot of poetry to it as well.
Totally. Beautiful. If we could somehow just surrender and celebrate. I know it's hard and terrible things are happening to our beloved human family, and beautiful things are also happening, and the earth is taking a breath. And I, for one, am excited about the possibilities going forward, of the rising of loving consciousness that I see. I know there's some horrible stuff also rising, people being brutalized by police, and a certain leader in a certain world power who every day does as much damage as humanly possible. All of those things are true too. But I believe, Krishna, and all of us, in the prevailing power of love and connection that I see rising everywhere right
Yeah. Yeah. Well, all those things you spoke to are they're tilling the compost for us. It's the fire to help it burn in a way, the equal reactions. So thank you for bringing it around there. And this feels like a good place to tie things up. How can people dive into your world and the richness of all this work that you've produced?
now. Well, thank you for asking. You can just go to my website, mirabaistarr.com, and all my books are there, and all the events that I was doing that aren't happening anymore. So a lot
Yeah.
of it is online. But what this time is giving me is a new chance to write, and I am writing, and it's very, very exciting to have the space to do that right now. So yeah, just my website, mirabaistarr.com, or just Google me and you'll find stuff.
Sounds good. And it'll be, of course, be in the show notes. But
Thanks,
thank you very much for giving us your time and sharing some of your thoughts. I hope we can do it again sometime.
Well, I love your work so much. It's so resonant with my
Oh,
heart.
thank you. Thank you. That's very sweet of you to say. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mirabai, for taking the time to come on the show. I really enjoyed getting to know you better after these years of crisscrossing from afar, and I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you. This song that you're listening to in the background is called Inward, and it's from a lesser-known album of mine called Portlanders that was from a long, long time ago. It was a live ceremony that I did in Portland for a few people, and it turned into a little album. This particular track is the first track on the album, and like I said, it's not one that gets a lot of love in the back catalog, but just wanted to kind of dig in deep and share that with you. So we're just going to keep on keeping on. You keep your head on straight, keep your heart centered towards your North Star that you have to choose. But keep walking your walk. Don't take any shit, my friends. I'll see you next week. Do it with grace, my friends. Do it with grace.